Our speaker today is Dr. Dave Waldien. Dave is a conservation biologist and National Geographic Explorer with over 25 years of experience catalyzing locally led sustainable conservation of the world's birds. He received his MS in Forest Ecology and a PhD in Wildlife Ecology from Oregon State University. He previously worked with Bat Conservation International for over 12 years. He's now a visiting assistant professor at the College of William and Mary, a graduate associate faculty at Christopher Newport University in the US, and serves as an honorary research fellow with Lubee Bat Conservancy and Harrison Institute. Since 2018, he has served as the IUCN's Red List Authority for Old World Bats, responsible for engaging bat experts from around the world to complete assessments of over 900 bat species to be published on the Red List of Threatened Species. During the COVID pandemic, Dave worked collaboratively to develop a process for students to work within academic classes and with species experts to draft Red List assessment of bats and other species, resulting in over 25 lead assessments published. Another 100+ assessments are in the process. As part of the Global Bat Diversity Network, he is co-leading a global effort to identify where bats may qualify as trigger species for key biodiversity areas. This process will result in a dramatic change to key BA trigger species and help advance bat conservation with local leadership. With that introduction, allow me to stop sharing and hand over to Dave so that he can take us through the presentation.
Thrilled for me to be here today. I've been working with the Red List since 2018. In 2017, I was bothering Tigga Kingston, asking her when the Red List would be updated. When would the Red List be updated? And one day she said, well, why don't you do it? And so since then, I've been working with people to attempt to do that on a regular basis. And what I'm going to present today is some insights into where we've come, where we're going, and opportunities for everyone here on the webinar series. So hopefully I've timed this reasonably well so where we have some time at the end. But if we don't have time to field your questions online, you can always contact me directly. So let me just get a couple things going. When I was thinking about the Red List assessment process when I first joined the group and the initiative back in 2018, I thought it was a well-running machine. There were things that were going on. And what I realized that my perceptions were a little bit off. And I didn't realize how much weight and work that we put on certain people like Bruce Patterson, who's on the call here today as well. But we put a lot of reliance, we put a lot of work on very few, at a global scale, numbers of experts. We locked them away in workshops in exotic remote locations and gave them a ton of species to assess in short periods of time. And they did some amazing work and they got a lot of species assessed. But one of the shortcomings from their output is that we came to realize and wanted to start to address is it resulted in relatively few people having input into species assessments, especially the people working on the ground with the species. And this was during a period when the internet wasn't as readily available for most of us. And in some cases, it led to incomplete assessments or less than complete. We ended up bottlenecking because we did a huge number of species and then no one wanted to look at them for another 10 years and so on. So we had out-of-date assessments that would emerge. We had out-of-date taxonomy because people like Bruce and many others were continually advancing our understanding of bat species, or taxonomy, where they're at, and conservation needs. So that was where the process used to be, in my view, and very simplistic. I'm sure it's much more complex than that. When I joined in 2018, I thought I was joining this well-running machine, and there was a lot of things that were going well. But what I quickly realized in working with others was that there was room for strengthening and improving the process. And since that time, we've been doing a number of things to slowly and incrementally change that process to engage people. And so our overall goal, and my goal today, is to talk with you about some of the assessment process, what actually goes on. A lot of people know of the red list, but they don't know how to get engaged, and they don't know actually what the process is. I'm hoping that in this webinar, we can engage and recruit people like yourselves to find a way to get involved. There's room for most people, many more people in this process. I wouldn't think of this as a good training, but it's a good introduction. But overall, we're going to want to train people to do more robust assessments, strengthen the assessments. We want people to complete assessments and the mapping, and we want people to be involved in the review process. All of this will result in a red list that is more effective, more representative, and more powerful for everyone to use. Okay. One of the other pieces I want to take a couple minutes at the end of the webinar to do is talk about how the red list relates to the key biodiversity areas, another global initiative that's underway with a number of groups around the world. All right, so first off, when we're talking about a red list assessment, it really is just an estimate of the extinction risk. It is not based on absolute knowledge. It's based on our current knowledge, the best information available from data, expert opinion, logical inferences, etc. It brings in population trends, where the species is found. It can talk about the past, it talks about current, and it can also look to the future to consider extinction risk. Now, that's an easy, and generalized definition, and that comes directly from the PowerPoint that the red list shares. When I think about it, it's just a structured species account. It has a little bit on its taxonomy, there's authorship, who does the work, etc. But it's a rationale for the extinction risk distribution, population, habitat ecology. Is the species used or traded? What are the threats, conservation needs, which includes research? And then there's obviously a bibliography. Now, my guess is anyone who's been in gone to college or working in the conservation field, you have all written and or read papers with this type of information. So a red list assessment isn't this, hidden sort of concept that only a certain number of people can do, and it requires some real structured training. Training helps, but it's a simple process with some standardized criteria that every one of you can do. I know that. I've worked with undergraduates to graduates to colleagues and professionals on this, and we all struggle with it in different ways, but everyone can succeed in this process. Okay, so what actually goes into this red list assessment process? And so when I was thinking about this presentation, I kind of put it together in this sort of framework. Okay, first and foremost, if you want to get involved in the red list process, you need to coordinate with the red list authority coordinators. You have to have current taxonomy. We need to have species that need a new assessment. We need to have a team to do the assessments. You need to draft and write the assessment. This is a process. I'm going to go into each of these in a little more detail. Review and accepted by those coordinators. We enter it into the database. It has at least 2 more review processes before they're submitted for publication on the red list. And usually there's 2 deadlines a year. Okay. This is an important step. And in my way of thinking about it, and in how I've chosen to approach my job, this part is if you get your assessment past my review, everything else usually goes very smoothly. Okay. In the past, we've ran into some challenges, which is why, if I do my job well, most of the rest of this flows exceptionally easily. Now, I've rarely had a question if I've done my job well. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, who are these pesky Red List Authority coordinators? So I'm the person for the Old World bats. Here's my email address. You can contact me directly. Email is best to reach out to me. I have a counterpart, Sergio Solari. He's the counterpart for New World bats. He's out of Colombia, and he works with all New World bats. And we work somewhat together, even though we have very distinct regions of the world. But if you want to get involved with the Red List process, you have to work with us, and for a number of reasons. You need to make sure that the species is currently recognized. Okay? I'll mention this, but there is a big discrepancy between what is a currently recognized species and the species that are online. We need to ensure that the Red List assessment is actually needed. We want to avoid duplication of work and effort, and reciprocal, we want to avoid gaps, species that need an assessment, but no one's working on them, or two people independently working on this same assessment. Those are what we want to avoid. The role that I see is to help you resolve any challenges in writing the assessment. And then maybe one of the big things that is helpful is in my role, or my approach to my role, it's that I am the primary point of communication with the Red List Authority and the Red List process. So I can communicate with them, I resolve their challenges and questions. And this is an important step because we've actually had contradictory information. We've had species assessments get submitted and then lost. And individuals around the world were communicating directly because there was, in my case, there was no Red List Authority at the time. Predated me and post-dating the last person. Okay. So work with us, myself and or Sergio Solari on the assessments. Coordinate with us and it goes smoothly. We have an accepted taxonomy. Everyone has their own views of what is a correct species or not. And just because it's a published species doesn't necessarily mean that it has been accepted. Currently, we have a taxonomy work group that has a large, I don't even know the number of people on it anymore, but we have global representation with this taxonomy work group. And currently, batnames.org is our taxonomic authority for bats. Okay? We're in the middle of a process change, and later in 2024, Bats of the World, this batnames.org is going to be transitioning. It's phasing out, and the American Society of Mammal Diversity database is going to become our taxonomic authority. In the last year or so, they've gone through a massive effort to align the taxonomy between the two systems, so that's up and done. And later in 2024, Red List is going to have the ASM Mammal Diversity database as our taxonomic authority. Okay. Currently on the Red List, about 1,300 species. Currently recognized over 1,400 species. So you can see that we have quite a bit of a discrepancy. Sometimes it's one species becoming two, other times it's species that are being put back together, depending on what those taxonomists do. So this is an ongoing effort. There's one change can result in more than one required Red List assessment update. Okay, so let's assume that you've coordinated with me saying that you want to do an assessment, and you have a species that is of interest that is currently recognized as a species. Well, we need to determine that it is or isn't in need of an assessment. So a new assessment or a reassessment. This could be a first-time assessment. It could be a reassessment of something that's already been done, etc. So the Red List Authority, they view an assessment being out of date when it reaches 10 years. 10 years since the last assessment. Right? That's their easy and default mechanism. Now, for many species, that's okay, least concern, etc. I believe that is too long, especially for the threatened species, which I'll get to in a moment. But for threatened species, I tend to want to have a 5 to 8 year window. We can also do a reassessment when there are errors in the existing assessment, and when there's new information that would change the status. Now, in the past, we've been bottlenecked by this every 10 years. Well, it's hard to do assessments at a global scale every 10 years and get through all these species for all taxonomy, not just bats, and get it through the Red List process. Okay, so we've approached this as an ongoing basis, and we're trying to transition through to where there's a regular input of assessments on an annual basis. But we have a good species, we have someone interested in it, and it needs an assessment. And so the team is confirmed. You can self-identify. I've worked with graduate students that said, hey, I'm working on such and such species, and I want to do a reassessment of it. So you can self-identify, reach out to me. I can, myself and Sergio, we're always actively trying to recruit people to do assessments. We may have workshops to do assessments as well. And Cecilia joined us for a Red List assessment workshop in Namibia last year. But all of this, you need to make sure that you're working with the coordinators. Okay? And at this point in time, once we have the team confirmed, we have the species confirmed, we know that it's a good species, and we know that it needs an assessment, then you're just in the process of drafting the assessment and mapping its distribution. Okay, this is the process where it can become a little bit of frustration because there's always bottlenecks. Okay. Now, keep in mind, except for some of the people on the upper levels of the Red List, okay, all of us, including the assessors, myself, and many others, we're all volunteers in this process. Okay, so once you write your assessment, every one of them needs to be reviewed and accepted by the Red List Authority coordinator. Now, if I don't do my job, then why am I even there? Okay, so everything runs through us, not to micromanage, but to ensure quality and to maintain that the process so we don't lose them in the midst of chaos with the Red List changes that are always perpetually happening. But once we have the Red List assessments completed and they're accepted, we enter them into the SIS Species Information System, the SIS database, which is an old clunky Red List database. There's a lot of power in it, but it is less than user-friendly. And so it takes a while to use it. It's a little cumbersome, but it's the tool that we use. So once it makes it by me, once it is in the SIS database, and I check it again to make sure that we have all the buttons checked, then I send it on for review by my colleague, Alessia Battistoni, out of Italy. I believe she's in Italy. She has to accept it, and then she sends it on to the mammal team, and that is the formal submission process. Okay? So you write it, review it, make sure it's good from your end. I review it, make sure it's good from my end. If it makes it by me, Alicia rarely has questions, and the mammal team even more rare. Occasionally, we miss some minor point that is quickly resolved. In general, Red List has 2 deadlines a year. Typically, they're in April for publication in July and September for publication in December. This year is a little bit different. There's actually a deadline in July for an earlier publication because we're coming up on a 4-year transition point in the Species Survival Commission planning. One of the things that is a little bit of frustrating on my end is that even though there are published deadlines on the Red List on when they accept the publication, it's when Alessia sends it forward. And Alessia may close it up to a month earlier than they published deadline. Okay. Now, all of this can be exceptionally frustrating. It creates some bottlenecks running it all through these 2 individuals, myself and Sergio. But if myself and Sergio do our jobs well, everything else goes smooth. If we let the issues through, we don't resolve them, then we will get them kicked back, and it takes longer. I've seen Red List assessments that have sat in the submitted category for several years, not within the bats, but for some of the reptiles. And in the past, before I joined for the Old World bats, we actually had assessments that were submitted and then lost because there was no person in my coordinator role. So this is frustrating. It's frustrating for you as an assessor. It's frustrating for me in my role. And, I'm the type of personality who will say, it's okay to be frustrated. I understand that. We can blow off a little steam, and then we try to find solutions. Okay. First and foremost, whether it's you or me, we have to have patience and understanding. We have to maintain our coordination and communication. And what we can do is increase our training on the expectations of an assessment. There are new requirements. What Bruce wrote in assessments, 10, 15 years ago is not, much of it is still relevant, but there are some new requirements and changes in what has been done. We need to improve and strengthen our writing of the assessments, and we need to improve our consistency to include, that the requirements are met and that the formats are followed. I've looked at lots of assessments, and what was accepted 10, 15 years ago would not pass the review process at the Red List level going in today. And so the ideas here that we've come up with to help in the Red List process is all coming from trial and error, past experiences, and trying to streamline the process to make it easier for people like you to get involved and participate. Okay? Yes, it can still be frustrating, but we can do this and move them forward together. All right. Now, all the materials for Red List assessments are online. Okay? You can find them there. But if you're coordinating with me, what I tend to do is try and get you trained, make sure you have the information available, and provide you some insights into how to best approach it. Now, when we're thinking about these criteria, there are 5 criteria that we are reviewing in the nature for the assessments. These are what's going to elevate a species to a threatened category. Criteria A, B, C, D, and E. I'm not going to go into these in great detail, if at all. But for a threatened category, these are all quantitative sorts of threshold for threatened, critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. Okay, those are the 3 threatened categories on the Red List. Everything else is not a threatened category, but it doesn't mean that they're not important to do assessments well. What I've done over the last, it seems like 4 or 5 years or more, is I've put together a Word document template based on the SIS database and my experiences working with a diversity of people. With my template has a lot of the required information and some suggested guidance on what to include and what not to include, or how to write certain things within this. So this Word template is a tool that we've created that can facilitate and guide and inform your writing. There are some new requirements. I'll mention a couple of them, but if you're going to get involved with the assessment process, we need to make sure that everyone is specifically aware of them. And as we're writing this and as we're using our tools available, there is this expectation of the assessments to be more robust and more complete than what was done in years past. Right? And this process is designed to strengthen and build upon that strong foundation that was there in the past. But now we have new tools available to us, and we have new standards and expectations, and we cannot write assessments based on yesteryear's standards. We have to write them based on today's standards. Okay. Here's a one-page summary on those red list criteria, criterion A, B, C, D, and E, and it has a lot of good information. I always pair this document with my Word document in helping people write their assessments. So one of the lessons, or one of the messages that I heard from people around the world when I first joined the Red List Authority, there was a lot of frustration. People were, because my position had been vacant for 3 or 4 years, I think. Okay. But I heard that there were messages from the Red List of thou shalt not use a data deficient status. Okay. You can only do certain things. You can't do this, you can't do that. Assessments were lost, communications were broken down, etc. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't hear all of this, but I've heard this long enough from multiple sources that I believe those sorts of things were happening. Okay? What I've asked you, if you've been involved in the Red List in the past, we recognize the past, we learn from the past, but we leave it in the past. Okay? That's what happened in the past. Today we're assessing the species. We can use data deficient. We use the best information available, the data that we have from the researchers like you, from the conservationists like you. We can also use expert opinion to help inform assessments. And we use the Red List coordinators, myself and Sergio, to resolve the issues in your writing of the assessments, but to resolve the issues, if there are any, with the Red List. And while I recognized and accept that there were issues in messaging, etc., from the past, since I've become involved, my communications have never run into any of these sorts of things. What I've encountered is misunderstandings, distortions, and then if I'm listening to you as an assessor, I'm listening to the Red List authorities and what they need and want. It's a matter of refining and changing expectations. So part of this was a communication breakdown. Part of this was real, but we don't hold on to those frustrations from the past. We build on and learn from them, and we make our assessments based on what we think is happening. Best data, best expert opinion, and let me worry about the issues. You'll be plenty frustrated with me in the writing process. Right? So I'm not going to go into all of these, but I wanted to highlight a few that are often overlooked in this process. So here's our overall number of IUCN categories. Some of these are no longer officially on the website, so not evaluated isn't on the website. But remember, here's our 3 threatened categories: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. So first up, I want to mention the near threatened category. Okay, it's not a threatened species yet, but it's not least concern. There are threats that are elevating the conservation status, risk, and concern. So it's near threatened when the status approaches one of those thresholds for those 5 criterion, and it's approaching that vulnerable category. Okay? Now, we can't just say, well, it's not least concern, it doesn't reach the vulnerable category, therefore it must be near threatened. If we want to use near threatened category, you must identify which specific category. It could be population reductions and declines. It could be the area of occupancy sorts of criteria. But you have to have specifics. You can't just say, hey, it's near threatened. You have to provide the justification, the logic behind your recommendation, the assessment recommendation. So near threatened is one that is often overlooked in the training, but there are some requirements in how we write this to where it is an acceptable assessment process. Another one is this data deficient. Again, it is kind of charged because of those past messaging issues with the red list. Okay. Now, data deficient is exactly what it says. Hey, we don't have enough information to do a real good assessment. Okay. One of the things that I've noticed in how people want to write data deficient assessments is they're looking for absolute information on a species for all aspects of it. Okay? We will never have perfect information. And if we put everything in this data deficient category, then species are at greater extinction risk because we're not recognizing their true status. Okay? So when you're considering, if you're doing an assessment and when you're considering is it data deficient, we have to use that best information available, the data. We have to look at past survey efforts. We can consider expert opinion, habitat trends within its range, etc. So there's a lot of things that can come into play for data deficient. When someone proposes data deficient, I look at this a little extra closely, not to say, no, you can't use it, but to look for the rationalization for data deficient. In some cases, I fully agree with data deficient. In some cases, we're missing just a single piece of information and it really is least concern. But we've also taken data deficient species and moved them into a threatened category. Okay? So this one gets a little special attention when I'm looking at it. Not to say that you can't use them, but you have to rationalize what you're doing and why you're doing it. The other category, and we used to have them on the red list on the front end, so not evaluated. Okay, if a species is not evaluated, guess what? It's actually not on the front end of the red list. So that 100+ species that are different from the currently published red list versus the recognized species, most of them are not evaluated. Some of those differences, the species was evaluated, but there have been changes. So not evaluated is part of our to-do list. Once we have a recognized species, let's go through the process and get it evaluated so that it is on the red list. And if it is a data deficient species, then it puts it on public notice and for people to actually take action to confirm what we know about the species. Okay. So one of the concerns, one of the challenges we have is, as scientists, as academics, as conservationists, we're looking for the best high quality data. We need that peer-reviewed published data for those quantitative thresholds. Absolutely, that's the gold standard, if you will. But just because there is a missing information, we don't have perfect information, it's not as good as it could be, we're missing certain pieces of it, it doesn't mean that we can't do a robust assessment, even recognizing the deficiencies of the assessment of those missing information. Okay? So when we're looking at how do we do an an assessment, we can use observation data, we can use peer-reviewed data, we can estimate different things, we can project information into the future, model, we can infer relationships, we can have suspected relationships. These all have specific definitions within Red List, which is beyond the scope of this particular presentation. But it's not just that peer-reviewed published data that goes into an assessment. Okay? There are lots and lots of key terms in this process. And Red List uses a lot of terms, and a lot of terms are a little bit counter to how we in the general conservation scientific community may use them. So as we go through and write assessments, we have to adjust our terminology and how we use certain words and how the Red List uses them. A couple things that is always, tripping us up. Population, this is total individuals. Population size, it's only the mature individuals. So population includes the juveniles, those that are post-reproductive, those that are pre-reproductive. Mature individuals are mature individuals known, estimated, or inferred to be capable of reproduction. Okay? Already I can hear the questions. Well, we don't know this for most of our bats. Absolutely. Okay? But we can make some generalized patterns. But these terms, if we use population, population size, recognize that they mean different things. Then they have subpopulations, so that there is some sort of distinctness within this, some demographic limitation in their genetic exchange. Very quick example, we'll call these maybe porpoises or something, large fins, adults, mature individuals, small fins, juveniles, pre-reproduction. Okay. Population as a whole was everything. Population size is only the large fins. And then subpopulations showing the geographic distribution of these particular individuals in this simplified example. Generation length has a very specific definition. Again, not a type of information that we tend to use within the bat community, not readily available. It has a very specific definition I'm not going to go into. Now, if we have it, great. If we don't have it, we can use this particular paper, Pacifici et al. 2013. It's not perfect, but at least it's a defensible, quasi-defensible published paper that we can point to. Now, if your species is no longer mentioned in this generation length paper because it's newly described, we can base generation length on similar species. Why this is important: if we don't have generation length, we cannot use criterion A, which is talking about population reduction and declines over 3 generations. Okay, so we need generation length to use one of our important criteria. The reductions, past, current, continuing decline over time. The more key terms, I'm going to move through here and highlight just a couple of them. Extreme fluctuations, I tend to not think of this as applicable to bats, just because bat populations can go down quickly, but they don't, because of the reproductive capacity, they don't bounce back quickly. Okay. But for this in general, if there's normal population cycles, that's not an extreme fluctuation, but there has to be some sort of threatening event that influences those normal cycles. Therefore, it would be an extreme fluctuation. Again, not generally recognizable, important for bats. Severely fragmented, a couple things I want to highlight here. We can look at it, and just because these habitat patches appear to be severely fragmented, it really depends on the species dispersal capabilities and what that matrix is. Some bats may be able to easily move across and among these different habitat patches, islands, or habitat within a landscape, terrestrial landscape, or they may be isolated. So you have to have some sense of the species dispersal capabilities as well as their matrix that they're crossing through. Okay. That'll give us insights into whether a species is severely fragmented. This also plays into two other key terms that people have struggles with. Okay. Even if we disagree with some of these definitions, we're still stuck with using them if we're going to use the red list. So extent of occurrence. This is one of the important changes from the past. Extent of occurrence is a minimum convex polygon, this red line, around all the known habitat patches and or point locations of your specimens. Okay. We do the minimum convex polygon. These could be islands and this could be ocean. You still include all of that ocean. Okay, extent of occurrence is that dispersion, that spread of the risk of extinction over the species distribution. Minimum convex polygon. Area of occupancy is measuring it in a different way. Where is the species actually found? So these would be those habitat patches. And you just sum up the areas where they are. Now, you can't just use the overall area. The red list has applied a standardized 2x2 kilometer grid. You overlay it across the species range, and then you can add up the occupied cells. Okay. There's two different ways to get at EOO and AOO to get at that extinction risk. This is all associated with criterion B. Okay, minimum convex polygon around the extent of occurrence, a 2x2 grid over the species distribution to get at area of occupancy. This is an example. I'm just going to go through, I'm going to skip over in this spirit of time. It'll be available on the, with the PowerPoint that is made available. Just really quick. Here's a hypothetical distribution. The red is where the species is extant. Black is where it was extirpated. You can do a minimum convex polygon around the extant location to give us that extent of occurrence. We don't include the vagrant sightings or species or areas where it was extirpated. Okay. For AOO, we may use this approach of known records, where we can just sum the cells with the actual records, the specimens. We may do it over the area of the habitat, or we could actually focus it in on critical roost sites or some other critical habitat feature. All right, I'm going to skip this as well. That's just an example that we use in Fiji. But for this, given that there's a lot of uncertainty, you may want to do a minimum and a maximum. I've used this approach where we use about 50% of the records or range where the number is used in the criteria. So if a cell only has less than 50%, we exclude it. If it has more than 50, we include it, and that can give us a minimum and a maximum to give us some level of uncertainty for AOO. Location. A num is a term that is defined by a single threatening event. I've simplified a couple of examples here. A threatening event, invasive species, or pollution. Black dots are the species stream and the lake here, an invasive species that can move upstream, downstream. This is two locations. The threatened event, invasive species. It can take out the main stem of the stream, but it can't move into the isolated lake. Pollution, same sort of thing, but it doesn't move upstream or downstream. Therefore, it is just one location going down the main stem, and then we have isolated locations on the sides. Again, locations are part of criterion B as well. So a few take-home messages real quick. Be consistent among the sections. You know, if you're talking about a 30% decline to get to a vulnerable status based on criterion A, if that's in the justification, you have to have it in the population section as well. There are assessments that are inconsistent and actually contradictory. They say one thing in one section and they say something else in a different section. Be consistent. So all of that to say is, yeah, there's a lot of information. That was a very quick run through. There's new information, but this red list process with the support mechanism, the new tools, internet communications, etc., there's a lot of room here for people to get involved to strengthen the red list and make it more valuable into the future. All right, I want to very briefly transition and emphasize that the red list is tightly connected with the key biodiversity areas. So KBAs, key biodiversity areas, are areas contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. Now, some people know of KBAs, other people don't know. They kind of generically know, or they may have very specific knowledge of it. Okay. In 2016, this new global standard was established. It was built by and led by these 13 leading conservation organizations that put together this global standard with a lot of input from people around the world. Okay. Historically, before that 2016 deadline, and even today, bats were rarely considered in past efforts to identify these, quote, important areas or key areas for conservation. Okay. In today's situation, the GBATnet Conservation Network we have a work group, Rachel and myself, and I'm not sure who else is on this group on the call today, are part of this group and working to proactively consider bats in all current KBAs and to maybe identify potential KBAs of which bats may be recognized as trigger species. KBAs have this global standard, science-based approach to identify them. They were developed, the standards were developed by the global audience, including bat experts. Okay? I was part of the process back in 2016, as were probably a number of other folks. Okay? But it has this standardized, systematic approach. Most of the criteria within this KBA standards have that direct connection to the red list. If our red list is out of date, doesn't have our species, guess what? Our bats are missing in the process. Okay? The KBAs were built and harmonized the foundation of based on the foundation of important bird areas, important plant areas, and other similar taxonomic models. So while the history of them came from other species, which is also why bats were rarely considered in the past, the current standard is explicitly open for including and considering bats in the process. And that's what we're trying to do. Now, KBAs are not the end all. Getting an area identified as a KBA doesn't mean that it's protected or anything. Okay? KBAs are just one step in the process for this protection gradient, recognition to full protection, formal protection, legal protection. KBAs may be a protected area, but they may not be. many of the protected areas were established for other reasons and don't have those standardized criteria. So the application of standardized criteria from KBAs may actually help strengthen our understanding of why a protected area is valuable if we apply the KBA standards. Now, in Latin America, they have a great model with ACOMs and CCOMs. These are bat-centric models. The RELCOM Bat Network developed these. And as my understanding is, most of them currently do not qualify as KBAs. They have a different set of standards that were built around what the RELCOM network wanted to do. There's a process underway that are looking at how ACOMs and CCOMs do or don't overlap and integrate with KBA as well as with protected areas. And this is also part of our work group to go through this process. So there are some similarities, but there are some differences. Now, one of the things I do want to end on here is KBAs are not the end result. One approach, ACOMs, CCOMs, KBAs, etc., does not negate the value of the others, but they can be a synergistic model for protecting and advancing conservation of species. Hey, people use red list KBAs all the time. National governments use KBAs within Sustainable Development Goals. They're part of the new 30 by 30 initiative, the Montreal standards. I forget the formal name, but KBAs are for conservation priority setting, expansion of protected area network, national commitments to the international environmental agreements. Funding organizations use KBAs, GEF funding, critical ecosystem partnership funding, and so on. So if you have an area with bats that are recognized as a trigger species within the KBA framework, you may be eligible for funding based on these particular ones. And the private sector actually are supposed to use, KBAs, international finance, industry, avoiding areas of KBAs, and so on. So KBAs has a lot of potential value. Right now, from a bat conservation perspective, we're not achieving much of that conservation value because bats are not considered holistically in KBAs. And that's one of the gaps that we're trying to fill. And part of that process is with the red list assessment process. All right, I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully I left a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that insightful presentation. Just to hear the amount of work that you put in to do the assessment of these species. I think in the chat, there's one comment, there's one question. There are two questions actually coming from Beratan. And the question there is, if the species uses certain locations only or seasonally, can we consider it as an area of occurrence? In theory, they don't occur there all through the year, and in some years they never come, they never occur there. How do you handle such locations where they occasionally occur?
Yeah, no, those are exceptionally important. And if you have the data to look at how species move, then the red list process has a mechanism. You can map them accordingly. So rather than on most red list maps just have that one uniform color, but you can map them as seasonal areas. Within the descriptions, you can identify them as, hey, this is an important seasonal migratory stopover, for example. So there are mechanisms within the red list process where you can not just specifically reference that seasonal migration and congregation, but you can actually consider it explicitly within the criterion threshold. You can map it, write about it, and use it in way to advance the conservation status.
The second question that was also in line with that one was that how do you tease apart migration and range expansion? If a species migrates to a new location but comes back to the original site after a season, can this be considered as a range expansion?
Well, range expansion will depend on where they're going. So, you know, if it's outside of their normal range and it's a migratory species, if they're incrementally moving forward, you can identify those areas in the same way. The mapping may not fully convey that, but you can write it out explicitly. And we are talking about this with the Phoropus medius, so the Indian flying fox, where there's range expansions and you're dealing with, you know, my impression, slow to fast declines within the range, but we don't have documentation of lost areas, but we do have documentation of moving into new areas. So there are ways to highlight it, and depending on your particular information, you should definitely highlight it because it's important for the consideration in the assessment.
I think we'll take one more question. I think there's a comment from Cecilia just saying, thanks for a great talk, Dave. Hope we can keep on working. We can keep on working on assessments together and with many new recruits. The last question that we'll get is, the same people involved in overseeing use of the new IUCN green list standards?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, so the new green list process, it is more of a data intensive process. I don't think to date we have had any examples of bats involved with or being assessed under the green list. So it can be the same people, but there's opportunities for people who want to try and approach this for the green list. Right now, that's beyond the scope of my work, but I don't think as a global audience and within the bat specialist group that we have anyone dedicated to the green listing process. Tigga Kingston and I were just talking about it a little bit. So, but if you're interested in it, reach out to me and we can follow up.
Thank you, Dave. There's a comment from Bruce. Bruce is saying, great talk, Dave. An observation, it is a common outcome of systematic revisions now using genetics and bioacoustic characters that a widespread species gets broken into a number of parts, some of which may be very narrow endemics with small populations. We need to couple assessments with systematic revisions. Maybe just briefly your reaction to that.
Oh, I fully agree, Bruce. One of the things that when people are doing these genetic and acoustics and other sorts of approaches for distinguishing these hidden species, the better they can do at writing their papers that say this is where the species is found, what it's no longer part of X, Y, or Z. The better they can do with that in their paper, the easier the red list assessments are. I'm working with David Allen on Myotis davidii, and it's a nightmare to try and figure out what did or didn't happen with some of these splits or combinations. So if you have specific examples, Bruce, let's talk and we can get people moving on them. But we definitely need those new assessments for those narrow endemics and small populations, because by definition, they're often under great extinction risk. So you guys have been great. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me directly.
Thank you very much, Dave. It was really a wonderful webinar, and also thanks to all the participants who were able to join us today. We look forward again to having another webinar on the 24th of July. Look out for another exciting webinar, just as always. So with that, we have to thank Dave and also enjoy the rest of the day for everyone who joined us. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.